Welcome back to the greenhouse video series. As you can see behind me, the frame is all up. I finished that up in the fall, so I'll go back and cover a little bit what I did back then. Today we're near the end of February. It's about 32 degrees out, so I have a little bit of spring fever and wanted to try putting some of the plastic up. It's a good day to do it. There's no wind. We're sort of at a calm before the storm. We're expecting to get some more snow tonight. So I'd put a few pieces of plastic up and see how it goes. This video is brought to you by our Patreon contributors. Our top tier contributors are TrueAquaponics.com, GlassBottleOutlet.com, GreenLifePlanet.net, and GrowPockets.com. Please consider supporting our channel by joining Patreon. After a while, I got a pretty good process in place with putting these together. I would assemble 3 of the hoops all at once and then lift them up into place with the bucket of the tractor. There was a short section of purlin hanging out from the rest of the greenhouse that I could hang them on without risking bending or breaking the purlin off. Once those 3 hoops were up into place, I could then add the next section of purlin, and I would just lift it up into place with the bucket of the tractor. It wasn't quite high enough, so from there I could prop it up with my extension ladder and get the right elevation. Once that was held into place, I could then anchor that purlin in with the rest of the frame. Once that was in place and supported by the greenhouse and by the ladder, I could then slide each hoop section out into its appropriate place and anchor it with its bolt. From there, I would add the legs on down into the ground, and it was supporting the whole purlin on its own. Now that the new purlin is placed and is sticking out pretty far, I could then assemble each hoop one at a time, lift it up into place with the bucket of the tractor, and slide it over the end of the purlin. I could get it positioned into place properly and then add the legs on and add additional support to that purlin. And just keep repeating this over and over until I get to the end of the greenhouse. Once I got a few of the hoops set up into place, I would then jump down into the trenches and do all the fine-tuning and alignment. It's pretty important to make sure everything is lined up properly and at the right elevation, so this would take a little bit of time to get everything into place. There's also a purlin along the side that has to go into place. This one's fairly easy to install because it's much lower, and it's fairly important because it helps keep the spacing of each of the hoops right at 4 feet. And once we start putting the plastic in, that will be fairly important because you can't have these things spacing out from one direction to the other too badly. As I progressed with the building, I would also backfill the trench a little bit. It was a little tricky getting in some of the tight spots, especially where my shipping container was. I couldn't just push the dirt in, so I'd have to very carefully put the backhoe into place, try not to hit too many things, and then scoop a little bit of dirt in one at a time. Still a little bit easier to use the backhoe than try to push all this dirt and stone into place with a shovel. I would fine tune a little bit with the shovel once it was all put into place and tamp it down with my feet. Over the winter, as the ground goes through its freeze and thaw cycles, it will settle in a little bit. Not a big deal. The frame will stay in place, the ground will settle down, and then we'll just backfill it a little bit more with some more sand or dirt. I didn't quite have all the frame in before the ground started freezing, and so it did go through a couple of freeze and thaw cycles, and with that the trench starts to collapse in. So I did have to do a little hand digging and make some new holes where the last few posts went into place. Not a big deal, just sort of a nuisance to have to get through all the muck. Also, my trench was off a little bit, so I was really close to the edge of it, so I had to dig into the sides of the wall a little bit. One of the benefits of having a slightly extra wide trench at the end, it gave me a spot to bury some of the bigger rocks that I had dug out instead of trying to find some other spot to dispose of them. Here's a little bit of drone footage I took just before finishing the filling of the last part of the trench. Overall, you can see that the frame is nice and straight. If you look right down that backbone, it's almost perfect. It's off maybe an inch here and there, but overall, nobody's ever going to really care about that much of a bobble. So for doing an install by myself, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. If only I could fly my drone as straight as I could build a greenhouse. For the covering, I did decide to spend a little extra money, and I went with the solar wrap film. People that use it have had it in place for 20 plus years versus the standard sheet film plastic where you get 4 or 5 years if you're lucky. This stuff has 2 layers with the bubble wrap in between, so it acts as a thermal layer. So I don't have to do like a dual layer poly and blow a fan for insulation. So this works basically the same way, but I permanently have this. So how this works is you have these little channels along the edges of each piece, and it slides right through these strips that are anchored to each of the hoops. So it's actually nice this way because then I can put it up myself without having a whole crew pulling plastic, and if something really does happen to this material, I can replace just one of the sections instead of trying to patch or replace whole sheets of plastic. So it's more of a long-term investment, and over the long term it will pay for itself. Each of these strips are 10 feet long. The manufacturer recommends that you put a fastening screw in every 12 to 18 inches, 12 inches if you have a lot of wind and snow loads. I'm going to put them in every 15 inches, mainly because it's easy for me to do the math when I mark out where I want to put the screws. I could just sort of guesstimate where each screw is going to go, but I'm a little bit OCD and don't want to have uneven spacing with my screws. I'm going to skip the first hoop for now. I still need to put the end walls in. The ground is frozen, so I can't really work in that area for putting the base of the wall in. So we'll start on the second section here. And this is going to take a little experimenting, I think, to get it right. So we'll see how this works out. I also need to leave a gap down underneath it so I can get the plastic to come out and then flare out over the top of the baseboard. Some of my long-term followers from years ago may recognize part of this frame. I've repurposed the old stand from the little Harbor Freight greenhouse and made a rack to hold these rolls. Figures. Afraid that's going to happen, but a couple concrete blocks on that will hold it up. All right, once I start pulling at it, it'll stand. I purposely kept all the weight on the backside so when it's rolling it wouldn't tip over forward, but it is a little back heavy. I should have angled it a hair, but it's welded and that's how it is. There are no shortages of counterweights around here. Perfect. If you haven't noticed, I'm sort of winging this as I go along here. I think I'm going to remove these screws so that way I can get the angle of these tracks to meet up properly with the roll, because I don't want it to bind and catch and rip in here. At some point I knocked out my microphone wire, so I'll just sort of explain what I did here. I'm now climbing up a little bit higher and pulling this through the tracks. The manufacturer recommends using some WD-40 or soapy water to spray into the tracks just to help keep things lubricated pretty well. So that's what I'm doing here. When I got through 20 feet of the track, the friction through the tracks was just a little bit too much for me to pull through. So I essentially abandoned one side of the track and finished pulling all the material through on just the one track. This really isn't fault of the product itself. Mainly the spacing between the hoops is varying a little bit above and below 4 feet on center. So once it goes above the 4 feet, it's just stretching that plastic between the two tracks too much and binding it up. I think if this was a new greenhouse that was made with some more modern practices and accuracy, this really wouldn't have been a problem. So here I'm removing some of the screws from the first track just so it can flex a little bit more. And that will allow me to easily slide the second track up into place. So here's that track going back in, and it slides right on once there's no tension in with the plastic. So I think this is really the best way for me to be able to finish putting the rest of this plastic up on the greenhouse. Just doing one track at a time and then sliding the other one in. And if any of the arches or the bows are spaced too far apart, I can use a come along or something to force the spacing between the bows to be exactly 4 feet. We got about 4 inches of snow last night. A lot of it's already melted off, but it slides right off the plastic without any problem. Leaves a nice little lump at the bottom here. So overall, from the first snow, very happy. That's about it for today. Wanted to thank you for watching. Next time around, I think we'll spend a lot more time on putting up the plastic, a few different techniques I have in mind for that. Probably take a couple weeks for the snow to melt and hopefully warm up again. Wanted to thank my Patreon contributors once again for helping to support the channel too. Thanks again.